The final night of King Harold II. The wind howled across the ridge at Senlac Hill, like the breath of some ancient god, carrying with it the metallic scent of blood and the acrid smoke of 1,000 dying fires. King Harold II of England stood alone in his command tent, the canvas walls snapping and billowing around him, like the sails of a ship caught in a storm. Outside, the sounds of his army preparing for sleep mingled with the groans of the wounded, creating a symphony of suffering that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. It was the 13th day of October in the year 1066, though to Harold it felt as if he had lived a dozen lifetimes in the span of 3 weeks. His reflection in the polished bronze mirror showed a man aged beyond his 44 years, his face carved with lines of exhaustion and worry, his once bright eyes now dulled by the weight of impossible choices. The crown of England sat heavy on his brow, though he had removed it hours ago and placed it on the small wooden table beside his sleeping pallet. In the flickering candlelight, it seemed less a symbol of power and more a golden shackle. He poured himself a cup of wine from the pitcher his squire had left, noting how his hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, he told himself, but from the bone-deep weariness that came from fighting 2 major battles in the span of less than a month. First, there had been Stamford Bridge up in the north, where he had crushed the invasion of Harold Hardrada of Norway and his own treacherous brother Tostig. That victory should have been celebrated throughout the kingdom, sung about in mead halls for generations. Instead, Harold had barely allowed his men a single night's rest before force-marching them 240 miles south to face a new invader, William of Normandy. The Norman Duke had landed on the 28th of September, setting up camp at Pevensey, and then moving to Hastings, burning and pillaging the lands of Sussex as if he already owned them. Harold had arrived on Senlac Hill just that morning, the 14th of October, his army exhausted, depleted, and stretched to breaking point. Yet they had fought with the courage of lions, forming the legendary shield wall that had held against wave after wave of Norman cavalry and arrows. Harold walked to the entrance of his tent and pulled back the flap, looking out over the encampment. Thousands of cook fires dotted the hillside, each one surrounded by clusters of men trying to warm themselves against the October chill. These were his men, his people, farmers and thegns, housecarls and firds, men who had left their fields and families to answer their king's call. Many of them had marched with him from the north, their feet bloodied and blistered, their bodies pushed beyond human endurance. How could he ask them to do the impossible once more when the sun rose tomorrow? A figure approached through the darkness, and Harold recognized the gait of his brother Gurth, Earl of East Anglia. At 34 years old, Gurth was 10 years Harold's junior, with the same broad shoulders and strong jaw that marked the Godwinson line. Unlike Harold, however, Gurth's face still held some of the optimism of youth, though it was fading fast with each passing hour. "Brother," Gurth said, his voice low, "you should be resting. Tomorrow will be the hardest day of our lives." Harold managed a bitter smile. "Tomorrow will be the hardest day, or it will be the last day. I find I cannot sleep knowing which it might be." Gurth stepped into the tent, and Harold noticed he was not alone. Their youngest brother, Leofwine, Earl of Kent, followed behind. At about 32 years of age, Leofwine had always been the most cheerful of the 3 surviving Godwinson brothers, quick with the joke and quicker with the sword. Tonight, however, his usual smile was nowhere to be seen. "We need to talk, Harold," Leofwine said, and there was an urgency in his voice that made Harold's stomach tighten. "About tomorrow's battle. About our strategy." Harold gestured for them to sit, and the three brothers settled onto the campaign stools arranged around the small table. Harold poured wine for each of them, and for a moment they simply sat in silence. Three men who had grown up together, fought together, and now faced death together. "Speak plainly," Harold said. "What troubles you?" Gurth leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Our position troubles me, Harold. We hold the high ground, yes, and our shield wall proved its worth today. But we are too few. We lost good men at Stamford Bridge, and we have had no time to gather reinforcements. William has fresh troops, rested horses, and the patience to wait us out." "We cannot wait," Harold said firmly. "Every day we remain here, William ravages more of my kingdom. Every village he burns, every field he destroys, weakens England. I will not allow that Norman bastard to carve up my lands while I sit on a hill and watch." "Then let us take a different approach," Leofwine interjected. "Fall back. Retreat to London. Gather every able-bodied man in the kingdom. Return with an army so large that William will have no choice but to board his ships and flee back to Normandy." Harold shook his head. The suggestion was not without merit. "And in the meantime, William consolidates his position. He builds fortifications. He brings more men from across the Channel. No, we must strike now, while he is still vulnerable. One decisive victory, and the Norman threat ends. Or one decisive defeat, and England falls," Gurth said quietly. "Brother, I beg you, think of the kingdom. Think of your sons. If you fall tomorrow, who leads England? Your boys are too young, too inexperienced. The kingdom will tear itself apart." Harold felt anger flash through him, hot and sudden. "You think I do not know this? You think I have not lain awake every night since I took this cursed crown, knowing that every decision I make could doom the kingdom I swore to protect?" He took a breath, forcing himself to calm. "But I am the king. I am the anointed sovereign of England. If I run now, if I show weakness, every petty lord and ambitious earl will see it. The kingdom will not rally to a coward, it will devour one." The tent fell silent again, save for the distant sounds of the camp and the ever-present wind. Finally, Gurth spoke again, and his voice was gentle. "No one would call you a coward, Harold. You have proven your courage 100 times over. You defeated the greatest Viking warrior of our age just 3 weeks ago. You have nothing left to prove." "Nothing except that I can keep my kingdom," Harold replied. He stood and walked back to the tent entrance, looking out at the fires again. "Do you know what I fear most? Not death, not defeat. I fear that in 100 years, in 1,000 years, people will look back at this moment and say that Harold Godwin's, the last true English king, threw away his kingdom because he was too proud or too stubborn to retreat. I fear being remembered as the man who lost England." Leofwine came to stand beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Then let us make sure that does not happen. Whether we fight tomorrow or whether we retreat, we face it together. 3 of us, as we always have." Harold turned to look at his younger brother, seeing the love and loyalty there, and felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You should both leave," he said suddenly. "Tonight, Take horses and ride for London. Live to fight another day. If tomorrow goes badly, England will need you." "Absolutely not," Gurth said, standing up so quickly his stool toppled over. "We are Godwinsons. We stand together, or we fall together. There is no other way." "He is right," Leofwine added. "Besides, who would protect your thick head if we were not there to guard your flanks?" Despite everything, Harold smiled. "You are both fools." "We learned from the best," Gurth said with a slight grin. A commotion outside the tent drew their attention. Harold heard raised voices, and then his chamberlain appeared at the entrance, looking flustered. "My lord king, forgive the interruption, but there is a messenger from the Norman camp. He says Duke William wishes to parley." Harold exchanged glances with his brothers. "At this hour? What game is William playing?" "Perhaps he seeks terms of surrender," Leofwine suggested hopefully. "Or perhaps he seeks to spy on our defences," Gurth countered. Harold made his decision quickly. "Bring him in under guard, and search him thoroughly for weapons." A few minutes later, a Norman knight was escorted into the tent by 4 of Harold's housecarls, their axes held ready. The knight was young, perhaps 25 years old, with the bearing of minor nobility. He bowed stiffly to Harold. "My lord king," he said in accented English, "I bring greetings from William, Duke of Normandy, rightful King of England." Harold felt his jaw clench at the title, but he kept his voice level. "Duke William has no right to the English crown. It was given to me by King Edward on his deathbed, and confirmed by Louis X. Whatever message you bring, deliver it quickly." The knight's composure wavered slightly under Harold's hard stare, but he pressed on. "My Lord Duke wishes you to know that he takes no pleasure in the bloodshed that occurred today. He proposes a solution that would prevent further loss of life on both sides." "I am listening," Harold said, though he could already guess what was coming. "Duke William asks that you acknowledge his rightful claim to the throne of England. In return, he would grant you the earldom of Wessex to hold as his vassal. Your brothers would retain their lands as well. All he asks is your oath of fealty and the crown that rightfully belongs to him." The tent erupted. Gurth started forward, his hand on his sword, while Leofwine let out a stream of curses that would have made a sailor blush. Harold held up a hand, and his brothers reluctantly fell silent, though their fury was palpable. Harold studied the young knight carefully, seeing the nervousness behind his brave facade. "Tell me, what is your name?" "I am Robert Fitzwimmark, my lord, vassal of Duke William." "Well then, Robert Fitzwimmark, I will give you an answer to carry back to your duke. Are you prepared to remember my words exactly?" "I am, my lord." Harold drew himself up to his full height, and in that moment he looked every inch the warrior king. "Tell William of Normandy that Harold, by the grace of God, King of England, rejects his offer with a contempt it deserves. Tell him that Edward the Confessor granted me this crown on his deathbed, as was his right as the anointed king. Tell him that the nobles and bishops of England confirmed my kingship, as was their right as according to English law. Tell him that any oath I may have sworn to him years ago was given under duress when I was his prisoner, and such oaths are void in the eyes of God and man." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And tell him this, Robert Fitzwimmark, tomorrow when the sun rises, we will settle this matter the only way it can be settled, by the sword and the will of God. If William wants the crown of England, he can pry it from my cold, dead hands. The Norman knight had gone pale, but he nodded. I will deliver your message, my lord. One more thing, Harold added, his voice softening slightly. Tell your duke that I respect his courage in crossing the channel with his army. Tell him that in another world, another time, we might have been friends rather than enemies. But tell him also that I will defend my kingdom with every breath in my body, and that the men who stand with me are the bravest in the world. If he seeks glory through conquest, he will find it tomorrow, but he may also find his death. Robert bowed again and was escorted from the tent. As soon as he was gone, Leofwine let out a long breath. Well, that tears it. No turning back now. There is never any turning back, Harold said quietly. He returned to his stool and sat heavily, suddenly feeling every one of his 44 years. William would never have let me keep Wessex. The moment I bent the knee, I would have become a puppet, and eventually he would have found some excuse to remove me. Better to die a king than live as a slave. Gurth poured himself more wine and drank deeply. Then let us talk strategy for tomorrow. William will not make the same mistakes twice. Today he threw his cavalry at our shield wall, and it broke against us like waves on a cliff. Tomorrow he will be more cunning. He will use his archers more effectively, Leofwine predicted. Today they shot too high, and their arrows passed over our shield wall. Tomorrow they will aim lower, try to hit our legs, and break our formation. Harold nodded. We need to reinforce the flanks. That is where our line is weakest, and we need to maintain discipline. Today, some of our men broke formation to chase retreating Normans and were cut down. Tomorrow, no one leaves the shield wall without my direct order. They talked long into the night, planning positions and contingencies, discussing which commanders should be placed where, which units were still fresh enough to hold critical positions. It was past midnight when Gurth and Leofwine finally left to check on their own men and get a few hours of sleep. Harold remained in his tent, knowing that sleep would not come for him. Instead, he pulled out a piece of parchment and a quill, intending to write letters to his sons in case tomorrow went badly. But as he sat there, staring at the blank page, he found he could not find the words. What did you say to children who might never see their father again? How did you comfort them when you were about to gamble their entire future on a single day's battle? He thought of his eldest son, Godwin, barely 18 years old and eager to prove himself. Harold had sent him to the West Country to raise more troops, a task that would keep him safe from tomorrow's battle, but would also fill him with guilt if his father fell. His other sons were even younger, boys who should be learning to hunt and hawk, not preparing to defend a kingdom against Norman invaders. And then there was Edith Swanneck, his handfast wife of more than 20 years, the mother of his children, the woman who knew him better than anyone. He had sent her away to safety weeks ago, and she had gone reluctantly, making him promise to come back to her. It was a promise he might not be able to keep. A noise outside his tent made him look up. He reached for his sword, but then he heard a familiar voice asking permission to enter. "Come," Harold called, and his most trusted advisor, Ansgar the Staller, ducked into the tent. Ansgar was an old warrior, well past 60 years of age, with more scars than hairs on his head. He had served Harold's father, Earl Godwin, and had been a steady presence at Harold's side for decades. Now, he looked at his king with concern. "You should sleep, my lord. You will need your strength tomorrow." "I will sleep when this is over," Harold replied, "one way or another." Ansgar sat down uninvited, which was one of the privileges of long friendship. "I was at the north end of the line today. I saw the fighting there. Our men held like champions." "They did," Harold agreed. "But will they hold tomorrow? And the day after that, if it comes to it? We cannot sustain a prolonged battle, Ansgar. William can afford to be patient. We cannot." "Then we break him tomorrow," Ansgar said simply. "We hold the shield wall until his men are exhausted, and then we push forward and drive them into the sea. It can be done. I have seen you do the impossible before." Harold smiled sadly. "Have I? Sometimes I wonder if everything I have achieved has just been luck and timing. Good men following a mediocre king because there was no better option." Ansgar's response was swift and sharp. "That is exhaustion talking, and I will not hear it. You are the finest warrior and the wisest leader I have ever known. Your father would be proud of the man you have become, and the king you are." He leaned forward, his old eyes fierce. "Tomorrow, when you stand before that shield wall and address the men, they need to see strength. They need to see certainty. Can you give them that?" Harold met his old friend's gaze and found his resolve hardening. Yes, I can give them that." "Good." Ansgar stood to leave, but paused at the tent entrance. "My lord, I have served 3 kings in my life. Edward was holy but weak. Your father was strong but too ambitious. You're the balance between them. The king England needs. Whatever happens tomorrow, you have been worthy of the crown. Never doubt that." After Ansgar left, Harold finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of what was coming. Tomorrow would indeed be the hardest day, the day that would determine not just his fate, but the fate of his entire people. The English had been invaded before by Romans and Vikings and Danes, but always they had endured, absorbing the conquerors and emerging stronger. But the Normans were different. If William won tomorrow, he would not integrate into English society. He would replace it, bringing his own language, his own laws, his own ways. The England that Harold knew and loved would cease to exist. He thought about the country he had sworn to protect. He thought about the villages and farms, the monasteries and churches, the ancient forests and rolling hills. He thought about the people, hard-working and proud, who had chosen him to lead them. They deserved better than this, better than a king who had led them into a battle they might not win. But there was no time for regret now. There was only tomorrow, and the slim hope that courage and determination might overcome superior numbers and fresh troops. Harold finally laid down on his pallet, not bothering to remove his armor. He stared up at the canvas ceiling of his tent, watching shadows dance in the candlelight. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, and he wondered if it was an omen. In Norse mythology, wolves were creatures of destruction and endings. Perhaps it was fitting. His hand moved to touch the small wooden cross that hung around his neck, a gift from his mother many years ago. He whispered a prayer, not for victory, but for courage, for himself and his brothers, for his men who would stand with him tomorrow, for the kingdom he loved more than his own life. As the candle burned lower, Harold's thoughts drifted to the strange twists of fate that had brought him to this moment. A year ago, Edward the Confessor had still been alive, and Harold had been the most powerful earl in England, but still just a subject. Then Edward had died. leaving no direct heir, and the Wetan had chosen Harold to succeed him. It had been the greatest honour of his life, and perhaps the greatest curse. He thought about William of Normandy, waiting in his own tent, perhaps a mile away. The Norman Duke was younger than Harold, only 39 years old, but he had been hardened by a lifetime of warfare. William had fought his own vassals, neighbouring lords, and even the King of France. He was ruthless, brilliant, and utterly convinced of his divine right to the English throne. In William's mind, Harold was nothing but an oath-breaker and a usurper, a jumped-up earl who had stolen what rightfully belonged to Normandy. The truth was more complicated, as truth always was. Harold had indeed sworn an oath to William years ago, when he had been shipwrecked on the Norman coast and taken into William's custody. But that oath had been given under duress, extracted by a man who held Harold's life in his hands. More importantly, it had been superseded by Edward's deathbed designation and the Wetan's confirmation. English law was clear. The crown could not be promised away to foreigners without the consent of the kingdom's nobles. William's claim was built on sand, but William did not care about English law or English customs. He had the backing of the Pope, who had sent him a consecrated banner to carry into battle. He had the support of adventurers and mercenaries from across Europe, drawn by promises of English land and wealth. And he had a burning ambition that would not be satisfied with anything less than total victory. Harold's eyes grew heavy despite his racing thoughts. He could not afford to sleep deeply, not with battle coming at dawn, but perhaps he could rest for an hour or two. He let his eyes close, the sounds of the camp fading into a distant murmur. In his dreams, he was young again, fighting alongside his father against the tyranny of Earl Godwin's enemies. He was at Stamford Bridge, watching Harold Hardrada fall, and knowing that the Viking age was finally over. He was in Westminster Abbey, feeling the crown placed upon his head, and the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders like a physical burden. And then he was here, on Senlac Hill, watching the sun rise on the 15th of October in the year 1066, the final day of King Harold II of England, the lost King of Scotland. The wind howled across the highlands like a banshee's wail, carrying with it the scent of heather and the whispers of forgotten battles. In the year 1746, the world knew of Bonnie Prince Charlie and the doomed Jacobite rising, but few remembered the name that had been deliberately erased from Scottish history. King Malcolm IV, known to those who still spoke of him in hushed tones as Malcolm the Forgotten. His story began not in the grand halls of Edinburgh or Stirling, but in a crumbling monastery perched on the edge of Loch Ness, where the water churned dark and mysterious beneath granite cliffs. It was there, in the summer of 1153, that a young monk named Brother Aldwin discovered a cache of documents hidden beneath the flagstones of the chapel floor. The parchments were ancient even then, their edges brittle with age, their words written in a mixture of Latin and Gaelic that required weeks of careful translation. What Brother Aldwin uncovered would change everything he thought he knew about Scottish history. The documents spoke of a king who had ruled for barely 3 years in the mid-11th century, a monarch whose reign had been so thoroughly obliterated from the records that even the chroniclers of later generations had no knowledge of his existence. This was Malcolm, son of Duncan I, elder brother to the man history would remember as Malcolm III, called Canmore, the great chief. The true Malcolm, the elder son, had been chosen as king in the year 1057, following the death of Macbeth at the Battle of Lumphanan. He was 23 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with hair the colour of autumn wheat and eyes that held the depth of the northern seas. Unlike his younger brother, who had spent years in exile at the English court, Malcolm had been raised among the Highland clans, learning their ways, speaking their tongue, understanding the ancient customs that bound the people to the land. His coronation took place on the hill of Scone, where Scottish kings had been crowned since time immemorial. The stone of destiny sat beneath him as the assembled nobles placed the crown upon his head, and for a moment it seemed that Scotland had found a king who could unite the fractured kingdom, heal the wounds left by decades of warfare, and restore the old ways that were slowly being forgotten. But Malcolm IV's vision for Scotland differed dramatically from what the powerful southern lords desired. While they looked to England and the growing Norman influence, Malcolm turned his gaze to the ancient Celtic traditions, to the laws of tanistry and the communal ownership of land that had governed his people for generations. He refused to grant vast estates to Norman knights, rejected the feudal system that was transforming England, and insisted that Scottish law and custom should remain supreme in Scottish lands. Within months of his coronation, the conspiracies began. The southern lords, many of whom had married into Norman families or held lands on both sides of the border, saw Malcolm's policies as dangerously backward, a rejection of the progress and civilization that the Norman influence promised. They whispered in dark corners about the young king's stubbornness, his preference for Highland counsel over their own wisdom, his determination to preserve a way of life they believed was destined for extinction. The leader of this faction was Thorfinn Sigurdsson, Earl of Orkney, a man of mixed Norse and Scottish blood who controlled vast territories in the north. Thorfinn had supported Macbeth's claim to the throne and had only grudgingly accepted the return of Duncan's line. He saw in young Malcolm not a king, but an obstacle to his own ambitions. Joining him were several powerful southern lords, Gospatric, who held lands in Northumbria, Siward's sons, who remembered their father's campaigns in Scotland, and most significantly, Malcolm's own younger brother, the prince who history would later crown as Malcolm III. The younger Malcolm, barely 18 years old, but already hardened by his years in England, had absorbed the Norman worldview completely. He had seen the great stone castles rising across England, witnessed the efficiency of Norman administration, and understood the power that came from adopting these new methods. Where his brothers saw the preservation of Scottish identity, the younger Malcolm saw opportunity and advancement. The conspiracy took shape over many months, conducted in whispered conversations and sealed letters carried by trusted messengers. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. They would not merely depose King Malcolm IV, they would erase him entirely. His reign would be stricken from the records, his name removed from the list of Scottish kings, his very existence denied by future generations. It would be as if he had never ruled at all, as if the crown had passed directly from Duncan I to Malcolm III, with nothing but Macbeth's usurpation in between. In the early spring of 1060, the trap was sprung. King Malcolm was invited to a gathering of the northern lords at Inverness, ostensibly to discuss matters of defence against Norse raiders. He travelled with a small retinue of loyal men, never suspecting that he rode toward betrayal. On the third night of his stay, as he slept in a chamber of Inverness Castle, armed men burst through the door. The fight was brief but fierce. Malcolm's personal guard died defending him, their blood staining the stone floor. The king himself killed 2 attackers before being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. But they did not kill him. That was crucial to the plan. A dead king could become a martyr, a rallying point for rebellion. Instead, they needed him to disappear, to vanish so completely that doubt would cloud any future claims of his existence. Bound in chains and gagged to silence his protests, Malcolm was smuggled out of Inverness Castle before dawn. A body, some nameless man of similar build, was dressed in the king's nightclothes and left dead in his chamber, his face so mutilated by sword strokes that identification would be impossible. The official story spread quickly. The king had been murdered by unknown assassins, likely Norse raiders or supporters of Macbeth's line seeking revenge. The younger Malcolm, displaying appropriate grief and righteous anger, was crowned within a fortnight. His first acts as king were telling. He granted extensive lands to Norman knights, established feudal obligations throughout the southern lowlands, and began the transformation of Scotland into a kingdom that resembled its southern neighbour. The old Celtic laws were gradually suppressed, replaced by Norman legal codes. The ancient system of tanistry, where kings were chosen by merit rather than strict primogeniture, was abandoned in favour of direct inheritance. And what of the true Malcolm, the forgotten king? He was taken in darkness to a remote monastery on the Isle of Skye, a place so isolated that few even knew of its existence. There, in a stone cell overlooking the churning waters of the Minch, he would spend the remainder of his days, forbidden from speaking his true name, watched constantly by guards who ensured he could never escape or make contact with the outside world. The monks who tended him were sworn to secrecy under pain of excommunication and death. They knew him only as Brother Columba, a nobleman who had taken holy orders after some unnamed transgression. Malcolm IV, rightful king of Scotland, disappeared into the mists of obscurity, while his brother wore the crown and shaped the kingdom according to his Norman-influenced vision. Yet the conspirators had underestimated the loyalty of some of Malcolm's followers. A handful of Highland chiefs who had supported the true king suspected foul play. They could not believe that assassins had struck so precisely, killing Malcolm while leaving his brother conveniently alive and ready to assume power. These men began their own quiet investigation, sending trusted agents to gather information, piece together rumors, follow the faint trails that the conspirators had tried so hard to erase. It took 3 years, but eventually they found him. A fisherman from the Isle of Skye, travelling to the mainland to sell his catch, mentioned to a contact in Fort William that the monastery on the western coast of the island housed a mysterious prisoner, a man who bore himself like nobility despite his monk's robes, who sometimes wept while staring across the water toward the mainland, who had eyes the colour of the northern seas. The loyal chiefs convened in secret, meeting in a hidden glen where their ancestors had gathered before battles in ages past. They debated long into the night about what should be done. Some argued for immediate action, gather their forces, rescue their true king, march on Edinburgh and expose the usurper. Others counselled caution, pointing out that Malcolm III was now firmly established on the throne, supported by powerful Norman allies, commanding armies that far outnumbered anything the Highland chiefs could muster. In the end, wisdom prevailed over passion. They decided to send a single man to the monastery, someone who could verify the prisoner's identity, and, if he was indeed their lost king, offer him hope that he had not been entirely forgotten. The man chosen for this dangerous mission was Cormac MacLeod, a warrior in his 40th year who had served in Malcolm IV's personal guard and had miraculously survived the massacre at Inverness by being absent that night on another errand. Cormac travelled to Skye in the guise of a pilgrim seeking spiritual guidance. The monastery accepted him without suspicion. They received few visitors, but turned none away who came in genuine faith. For 2 weeks, Cormac lived among the monks, participating in their prayers and labours, carefully observing everyone he encountered, searching for the man he had once sworn to protect with his life. He found him in the monastery garden, tending to herbs with hands that had once wielded a sword with deadly skill. The years had aged Malcolm. He was now 26, but looked older, his hair touched with premature grey, his face lined with sorrow and resignation. Yet Cormac knew him instantly, would have known him anywhere. Those distinctive eyes that could belong to no other. Their meeting had to be carefully orchestrated. Cormac waited until the afternoon prayers, when most of the monks gathered in the chapel, leaving only a few brothers working in the gardens and outbuildings. He approached Malcolm while the deposed king knelt among the rosemary and thyme, his hands dark with soil, his monk's robe dusty from his labours. "Brother Columba," Cormac said quietly, using the name the monks knew, "might I seek your counsel on a spiritual matter?" Malcolm looked up, and for a heartbeat, recognition flashed across his features. But years of captivity had taught him caution. He rose slowly, brushing dirt from his hands, his expression carefully neutral. "Of course, my son, walk with me, and we shall talk." They moved deeper into the garden, away from the monastery buildings, toward a low stone wall that overlooked the sea. Only when they were certain no one could overhear did Cormac speak again, this time in the Gaelic tongue, rather than the Latin the monks preferred. "My lord," he said simply, "your people have not forgotten you." Malcolm closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they glistened with tears he refused to let fall. "Cormac," he whispered, "you survived Inverness. Thank God. I had feared all my loyal men perished that night." "Most did, sire, but a handful of us escaped, and we have been searching for you these 3 years past. The Highland chiefs know of your imprisonment. They would raise armies to free you if you but give the word." For a long moment, Malcolm said nothing, staring out across the water toward the mainland, toward the kingdom that should have been his. The wind pulled at his robes, carrying the salt scent of the sea and the distant cries of seabirds. "No," he said finally, his voice heavy with resignation. "Too much blood has already been spilled in Scotland's name. If the chiefs rise up now, my brother will crush them utterly, and Norman armies will devastate the Highlands. The people will suffer for my sake, and I cannot bear that burden." "But you are the rightful king," Cormac protested. "Malcolm III sits on a throne built on treachery and lies. History must know the truth." "History," Malcolm said bitterly, "is written by those who hold power, not by those who hold the right. My brother has already succeeded in erasing me from the chronicles. To future generations, I will be nothing more than a footnote, if I am remembered at all. perhaps that is for the best. How can you say such a thing? You fought for Scotland, for the old ways, for everything our people holds sacred. Malcolm turned from the sea to face his former guard, and Cormac was struck by the change in him. This was no longer the fierce young king who had defied the Norman lords, but a man who had been broken by years of isolation and helplessness, worn down by the knowledge that his sacrifice had changed nothing. The old ways are dying, Cormac. Perhaps they were always doomed. My brother understands what I was too proud to see. Scotland cannot stand alone against the tide of change sweeping across these islands. The Norman influence will transform us, whether we wish it or not. By resisting, I might have doomed our people to perpetual warfare and poverty. At least my brother's path offers stability, even if it means surrendering much of what made us uniquely Scottish. Then you will remain here. Accept this imprisonment without protest? What choice do I have? If I escape, if I reveal myself, I doom countless others to death in a war they cannot win. Better that I remain Brother Columba, a forgotten man in a forgotten place, and let Scotland move forward without me. Cormac felt his heart break for his king, seeing the defeat in his eyes, the weight of abandonment and loss that bowed his shoulders. The chiefs asked me to tell you something, sire. They said that even if you cannot be restored to your throne, even if the world never knows your name, they will preserve your memory. They will pass down the truth from father to son, from generation to generation, so that somewhere in some hidden corners of the Highlands, people will always know that once there was a king who fought for them, who chose exile over compromise, who sacrificed everything rather than betray the old ways. For the first time since their conversation began, Malcolm smiled, a sad, weary smile, but genuine nonetheless. That is worth more than any crown, old friend. Tell them I accept their gift gratefully. Tell them to care for our people, to preserve what they can of our traditions, to remember that being Scottish means more than simply occupying this land. It means carrying forward the values and customs that our ancestors died to protect. They spoke for another hour, sharing news and memories. Two men bound by loyalty and loss, standing at the edge of the world while history moved on without them. When Cormac finally departed the monastery, he carried with him not the vengeful declaration of a deposed king demanding restoration, but rather a message of acceptance and hope, that even in defeat, even in obscurity, Malcolm had found a kind of peace. The Highland chiefs received Cormac's report with mixed emotions. Some raged against Malcolm's decision, arguing that he had no right to deny his people the chance to fight for him. Others understood his wisdom, recognizing that pragmatism sometimes required painful sacrifices. In the end, they honored his wishes. There would be no rebellion, no attempt to rescue him from his island prison, no public revelation of his survival. Instead, they began the long work of preservation. In hidden glens and remote valleys, and whispered stories told by firelight, the true history of Malcolm IV lived on. Bards composed ballads about the lost king, though they were careful never to sing them where spies for Malcolm III might hear. Scribes copied the few documents that proved his existence, hiding them in secret locations where future generations might one day discover them. Brother Aldwin's discovery in 1153 was one fruit of this careful preservation. The documents he found had been hidden there by one of Malcolm's loyal followers, tucked away in the hope that someday someone would find them and learn the truth. The monk spent the last years of his life carefully translating and copying these precious parchments, creating multiple versions that he distributed to trusted contacts throughout Scotland. But the effort to preserve Malcolm's memory faced constant opposition. Malcolm III and his successors worked tirelessly to erase any trace of the forgotten king. Monasteries were searched, suspicious documents were burned. Anyone caught speaking of a Malcolm who had ruled before Malcolm Canmore faced severe punishment. The official history was clear. Duncan I had been succeeded by the usurper Macbeth, who was eventually defeated by Malcolm III. There was no room in this narrative for another Malcolm, no space for a king who had inconveniently embodied values that the new Scotland was leaving behind. On the Isle of Skye, Brother Columba continued his quiet existence. The years passed slowly, marked by the changing seasons and the eternal rhythm of monastic life. He rose before dawn for prayers, worked in the gardens, studied scripture, and maintained his silence about his true identity. The monks who guarded him grew old and were replaced by younger men who knew nothing of the monastery's secret prisoner, who simply saw another brother devoted to a life of prayer and contemplation. Malcolm aged along with his jailers and fellow monks. The grey in his hair spread until it was entirely silver. His hands, once so strong and skilled with weapons, became gnarled with arthritis from years of manual labour. His eyes, those distinctive northern sea eyes that had once burned with passion for his kingdom, grew dim with cataracts. He became an old man long before his years should have made him so, worn down by isolation and the weight of dreams abandoned. He died in the winter of 1093, 33 years after his deposition, having outlived his usurping brother by 2 years. He was 56 years old, but looked 20 years older. The monks buried him in their cemetery with all the proper rites, marking his grave with a simple stone that bore the name Brother Columba and the dates of his entry into the monastery and his death. No mention was made of his royal blood, his rightful claim to the throne, or the kingdom he had lost. The abbot who presided over the funeral was one of the few remaining monks who knew the truth about Brother Columba's identity. As he scattered holy water over the grave, he whispered a prayer that the official liturgy did not include. Rest now, Malcolm IV, King of Scotland. You fought for your people and lost, but you are not forgotten. Your sacrifice was not in vain, and your memory will endure long after the stones of castles have crumbled to dust. The centuries rolled forward, and Scotland transformed beyond anything Malcolm would have recognised. The Norman influence his brother had welcomed reshaped the kingdom completely. Great stone castles rose across the land, replacing the old hill forts. The feudal system took root, creating a rigid hierarchy of nobles and vassals. The Celtic laws and customs that Malcolm had fought to preserve were gradually suppressed, surviving only in the most remote corners of the Highlands. Yet the memory of the lost king persisted in those hidden corners. In the 18th century, when Bonnie Prince Charlie raised his standard and called the clans to fight for the Stuart cause, old men told their grandsons about another prince, another king, who had been betrayed and forgotten. The parallel was not lost on them. Both men had represented a vision of Scotland that modernity seemed determined to destroy. Both had been defeated not by superior force alone, but by the inevitable march of historical change. After the final defeat of the Jacobites at Culloden in 1746, when the British government set about systematically destroying Highland culture, burning clan tartans, banning bagpipes, and forcing the people to abandon their traditional ways of life. A few elderly Highlanders made secret pilgrimages to the Isle of Skye. They sought out the old monastery, which had long since fallen into ruins, and searched among the tumbled stones and overgrown graves for any trace of the king their ancestors had served. Most found nothing. The centuries had erased names from weathered headstones, and the monks who had known the truth were 600 years dead. But one searcher, a man named Angus MacLeod, who claimed descent from Cormac himself, discovered something remarkable. Beneath a collapsed section of the monastery wall, protected by the fallen stones, was a small stone box. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow survived the centuries, were 3 parchment pages covered in faded but still legible writing. The documents were in a mixture of Latin and Gaelic, written in different hands, apparently compiled by several authors. They told the story of Malcolm IV, his brief reign, his betrayal, his imprisonment, and his death. They named the conspirators, described the plot in detail, and preserved testimony from witnesses who had seen the deposed king alive, years after he was supposed to have died. Most remarkably, they included a physical description of Malcolm that matched perfectly the few contemporary accounts that had survived, leaving little doubt about the document's authenticity. Angus MacLeod understood immediately what he had found. These pages were proof, fragile, ancient, but undeniable proof that the lost king had existed, that he had been deliberately erased from history, that the official chronicles of Scotland had been falsified to hide an inconvenient truth. He carefully rewrapped the documents and carried them home, where he made meticulous copies before hiding the originals in a new location, learning from history's lesson that precious things should never exist in only one place. He shared the discovery with a small circle of trusted friends, men who still valued the old Highland ways despite the laws forbidding such sentiments. They discussed what should be done with this evidence. Should they publish it, expose the historical lie, demand that Malcolm IV be restored to his rightful place in the Chronicle of Scottish Kings? Or would such a revelation simply invite the authorities to confiscate and destroy these precious documents, silencing the lost king's voice forever? In the end, caution prevailed once again. Scotland in the mid-18th century was a dangerous place for those who clung to old traditions and challenged official narratives. The documents were copied several more times, with the copies distributed to various hiding places throughout the Highlands. The originals were sealed in a metal box and buried in a secret location known only to Angus MacLeod and his eldest son. The story might have ended there, with Malcolm IV remaining a whispered legend, a ghost story told by Highland fireplaces, believed by some but dismissed by most as romantic folklore. But history has a way of refusing to stay buried, and the lost king was not quite ready to be forgotten. In the late 19th century, during the Victorian period's romantic fascination with Celtic history, a scholar named Dr. James Sinclair began researching anomalies in the Scottish chronicles. He noticed small inconsistencies in the dating of events during Malcolm III's early reign, gaps in the narrative that didn't quite make sense, references in Irish and Welsh documents to Scottish events that the official Scottish histories never mentioned. Being a meticulous researcher, he began compiling these discrepancies, trying to understand what they might indicate. His investigation led him to the Highlands, where he collected oral histories from elderly residents of remote communities. Time and again, he encountered variations of the same story: a king before Malcolm Canmore, a betrayal, an imprisonment, a deliberate erasure. The details varied, and Dr. Sinclair knew that oral tradition could be unreliable, prone to embellishment and confusion. But the consistency of the core narrative, appearing in communities that had little contact with one another, suggested that these stories might have a common root in actual historical events. Dr. Sinclair's research culminated in a scholarly paper published in 1887, titled The Lost King Hypothesis: Evidence for an Erased Reign in 11th Century Scotland. The paper was cautious in its claims, presenting the evidence without making definitive statements, acknowledging the difficulties of proving events that powerful forces had worked hard to obscure. Nevertheless, it created a minor sensation in academic circles, inspiring other scholars to investigate the mystery of Malcolm IV. The truth, when it finally emerged into the light of accepted history, came not from academic research, but from an accident of fate. In 1942, during the Second World War, German bombers targeting industrial sites in Scotland dropped their payload on what they believed to be a factory, but was actually an ancient manor house being used as military storage. The explosion destroyed the building, but also cracked open a sealed chamber in its foundation, a room that had been locked and forgotten for centuries. Among the debris, soldiers found a collection of documents that had survived by pure chance, protected by the manor's thick stone walls, even as the building above them collapsed. These papers, when examined by historians, proved to be a cache of correspondence between Malcolm III and his fellow conspirators, dating from the years 1058 through 1062. The letters discussed the plot against the elder Malcolm in shocking detail, including explicit acknowledgement that they planned not just to depose him, but to erase him from history entirely. The discovery made headlines throughout Britain. Here was proof, written in the conspirators' own hands, that a king named Malcolm had indeed ruled Scotland before Malcolm III, and that his reign had been deliberately suppressed. Academic historians rushed to re-examine the chronicles, looking for other evidence that might have been overlooked or misinterpreted. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to reconstruct the true story of Malcolm IV, corroborating the oral traditions that Highland communities had preserved for nearly 900 years. Today, Malcolm IV is recognised by historians as a legitimate king of Scotland, though many details of his reign remain obscure. His name has been added to the official list of Scottish monarchs, and scholars continue to uncover new evidence about his brief time on the throne. Yet for all the academic recognition, he remains the lost king, a figure more legendary than historical, a symbol of the paths not taken and the dreams that died before they could be fulfilled. In the Highlands, where his memory was kept alive through centuries of suppression, the vindication of Malcolm's existence brought a measure of satisfaction to the descendants of those who had never forgotten him. The old stories were true after all. There had been a king who fought for the old ways, who chose exile over compromise, who was betrayed and erased, but whose memory survived through sheer, stubborn loyalty. The monastery on Skye, where Malcolm spent his final years, is now a protected historical site. Archaeologists have excavated the ruins, finding among the remains a grave that might be his, though definitive identification is impossible after so many centuries. A simple monument stands there now, bearing an inscription that attempts to summarize a complex life in a few brief words. Here lies Malcolm IV, King of Scotland, who ruled from 1057 to 1060. He fought for his people and lost, but he was not forgotten. The Lost King's story resonates across the centuries because it speaks to fundamental human experiences. The pain of betrayal, the weight of impossible choices, the courage required to accept defeat with dignity. Malcolm IV could have condemned his people to endless warfare in defense of his crown. Instead, he chose obscurity and isolation, allowing history to move forward without him, preserving peace at the cost of his own legacy. In that choice, perhaps, lies his true greatness. Not in the battles he might have won or the reforms he might have implemented, but in his willingness to surrender everything when he understood that fighting would bring only suffering to those he had sworn to protect. The forgotten king became, in the end, the sacrificial king, offering himself so that others might live. His name may have been erased from the chronicles for centuries, his reign reduced to a footnote in academic texts, but the lost King of Scotland achieved a kind of immortality that no amount of suppression could destroy. He lives on in the stories still told by Highland firesides, in the scholarly debates about Scotland's medieval history, in the hearts of all who understand that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in fighting to the end, but in knowing when to let go. And somewhere, in hidden places throughout Scotland, the documents that Angus MacLeod copied so carefully still exist, waiting to be discovered by future generations. The lost king's voice continues to echo through the centuries, a reminder that history is never quite as simple as it seems, that truth has a way of surviving even the most determined attempts to bury it, and that the forgotten are often the ones most worth remembering. The forgotten Ice King of the North. In the far reaches of the world, where the auroras painted the sky in ribbons of emerald and violet, there existed a kingdom that time itself seemed reluctant to remember. The land stretched across frozen tundras and mountains of crystalline ice that caught the weak sunlight and scattered it into 1,000 dancing prisms. This was the domain of Iscaran the Pale, a ruler whose name had been whispered in awe and terror for generations, though now those whispers had faded into the howling winds that swept across his desolate realm. Iscaran had not always been forgotten. Once, his kingdom of Norvengard had been a jewel among the northern territories, a place where artisans crafted sculptures from ice that never melted, and where merchants travelled from distant lands to trade in furs so white they seemed spun from clouds. The capital city, Crystal Haven, had risen from the permafrost like a crown of frozen stars, its spires reaching toward the heavens as if in defiance of the harsh climate that sought to crush all life beneath its weight. In those days, Iscaran had been called the Just, the Wise, the guardian of the eternal winter. His people had loved him, for he had brought prosperity to a land where survival itself was an achievement worthy of celebration. But that was before the curse, before the long silence, before the world turned its back on the Ice King and his frozen domain. Now, 3 centuries after his disappearance from the annals of history, Iscaran sat alone in his throne room, a vast chamber carved from a single glacier that had stood for millennia. The throne itself was a masterwork of nature and magic combined, formed from ice that blazed with an inner light neither warm nor cold, but something in between, something that existed outside the normal laws of temperature and time. The Ice King's appearance reflected the centuries of isolation that had consumed him. His hair, once golden like the brief summer sun that graced these lands, had turned to pure white, flowing past his shoulders in waves that seemed to move with a wind that wasn't there. His skin had taken on the translucent quality of ancient ice, pale blue veins visible beneath the surface, like rivers frozen in time. His eyes, however, remained unchanged, a deep blue that held the color of the deepest ocean, still sharp and aware despite the weight of 300 years of solitude. He wore robes of white fur and silver thread, garments that had not aged because nothing in his kingdom aged anymore, suspended as it was in a moment that refused to end. Iskarin rose from his throne, his movements fluid despite the ages he had sat there. He walked to one of the great windows that lined the throne room, each pane made from ice so clear it might have been glass, had glass been able to withstand the bitter cold that was the natural state of Norvengard. Beyond the window stretched his kingdom, a landscape of haunting beauty and terrible emptiness. The city of Crystal Haven spread below him, its buildings intact, its streets unmarked by the passage of time, but utterly devoid of life. No smoke rose from chimneys, no voices carried on the wind. The marketplace where thousands had once bartered and laughed now stood silent, stalls still arranged as they had been on that day. 3 centuries passed when everything had changed. The Ice King pressed one pale hand against the window, and frost bloomed from his fingertips in intricate patterns that resembled nothing so much as memories given form. He could see them there in the frost. His wife, Alara, her dark hair a stark contrast to the whiteness of their world, her laughter bright enough to warm even the coldest winter day. Their daughter Freya, barely 10 winters old when the curse had fallen, her small hands always cold despite the furs they wrapped her in, her smile capable of melting his heart in ways the endless winter never could. His advisors, his guards, his subjects, all of them preserved in these frost memories, forever young, forever lost. The curse had come without warning, as such things often do. Iskaron had been a just ruler, perhaps too just for the liking of some. He had refused the demands of the witch lords of the eastern wastes, a cabal of sorcerers who had sought to use Norvengard as a staging ground for their conquest of the southern kingdoms. When they came with their armies of ice wraiths and frost giants, Iskaron had stood against them with his own magic, for the rulers of Norvengard had always possessed a connection to the winter, an ability to call upon the cold itself as both weapon and shield. The battle had raged for 7 days and 7 nights, the sky itself torn apart by competing magics. Iskarin had proven stronger than the witch lords anticipated. One by one, he had shattered their armies, breaking the ice wraiths back into the formless cold from which they came, sending the frost giants fleeing back to their mountain caves. On the 7th day, as victory seemed certain, the witch lords had played their final desperate card. They had combined their remaining power into a single curse, not of destruction, but of isolation, not meant to kill, but to remove Norvengard from the world entirely. The curse had struck like a wave of invisible force, washing over the kingdom in an instant. Iskarin had felt it the moment it took hold, a sensation like being encased in amber, like being caught between one heartbeat and the next. Every living thing in Norvengard had been frozen, not in ice, but in time itself. His people had simply stopped, caught mid-step, mid-word, mid-breath. Children remained suspended in the act of throwing snowballs. Merchants held coins that would never complete their journey from hand to hand. His wife and daughter, who had been standing beside him on the palace balcony, became as still as statues carved from flesh. But Iskeran himself had been spared this fate, and that had been the cruelest part of the curse. As the ruler, as the one who wielded the magic of winter, he remained conscious, aware, alive in a way his subjects were not. He could move, could think, could feel, and feeling was the torture of it. The witch lords had ensured he would remain awake to witness his failure, to spend eternity among his frozen people, unable to break the curse, unable to save them, unable even to join them in their timeless sleep. The first century had been the hardest. Iskeran had tried everything within his considerable power to break the curse. He had pored over every scroll in the royal library, had attempted counterspells and rituals that drained him to the point of collapse. He had climbed to the highest peak of the Frostspire Mountains and called out to the ancient spirits of winter, begging for their aid. He had descended into the deepest ice caves where the old magic was said to dwell, offering himself as a sacrifice if only his people could be freed. Nothing had worked. The curse was too powerful, too perfectly crafted. It was woven from the combined might of 7 witch lords, and it would require something equally powerful to undo it. The 2nd century had brought resignation. Iskeran had continued his studies, but with less urgency, knowing in his heart that he had exhausted every possibility. He had walked among his frozen subjects, speaking to them as if they could hear, telling them stories of what the world beyond their kingdom must be like now. He had maintained the city as best he could, using his magic to repair structures damaged by the occasional earthquake or storm. He had kept Crystal Haven pristine, a perfect snapshot of a moment 300 years past, because to let it decay would have been to admit defeat, to acknowledge that his people were truly lost. The 3rd century, the one in which he now found himself in its twilight years, had brought something unexpected. Not hope, exactly, but a kind of renewed purpose. Iskeran had begun to notice changes in the world beyond his kingdom. The aurora lights that danced above Norvengard had started to pulse with patterns he had never seen before. The winds that swept across the tundra carried whispers of words and languages that had not existed when his kingdom fell. Most significantly, he had felt tremors in the fabric of the curse itself, tiny fluctuations that suggested something in the wider world was changing, shifting in ways that might finally affect the magic that held Norvengard in its grip. It was this realization that had drawn him from his throne today. For the first time in 300 years, Iskeran felt something he had thought lost forever, the possibility of change. He turned from the window and made his way through the silent palace, his footsteps echoing in halls that had known no other sound for centuries. He passed through corridors lined with portraits of his ancestors, rulers of Norvengard stretching back 1,000 years, each one wearing the same crown of ice and silver that now rested on Iskeran's head. He wondered what they would think of him, whether they would see his survival as strength or his inability to break the curse as weakness. The palace library was his destination, a vast circular room with shelves that spiraled up toward a domed ceiling, painted with a map of the stars as they had appeared on the night of Norvengard's founding. Iskeran had spent countless hours here, surrounded by the accumulated knowledge of his people, books on magic and history, scrolls detailing ancient rituals, tablets carved with the words of the first winter mages. All of it had been consumed and studied and memorized until he could recite entire volumes from memory. But today he sought something specific. Deep in the library's heart, protected by wards only he could pass, stood a single pedestal made from black ice quarried from the deepest part of the northern ocean. Upon this pedestal rested a book bound in white leather, its pages made from something that was neither paper nor parchment, but rather seemed to be frozen light given solid form. This was the Codex of Endless Winter, the most sacred text of Norvengard, written by the kingdom's founder, Cormac I, more than a millennium ago. Iskeran had consulted the Codex countless times over the centuries, but always he had focused on the sections dealing with magic, with spells and counter curses. Now, prompted by some instinct he could not name, he opened the book to its final pages, sections he had largely ignored because they dealt not with magic but with prophecy. Cormac had possessed the gift of foresight, and in his final years he had recorded visions of Norvengard's future, cryptic passages that spoke of trials and triumphs yet to come. The Ice King's fingers traced over words written in silver ink that shimmered even in the dim light of the library. Most of the prophecies he had read before and dismissed as either fulfilled or irrelevant, but one passage now caught his attention, a verse he had somehow overlooked in all his previous readings, or perhaps one that had not been visible until this moment. The ink seemed to glow brighter as his gaze fell upon it, and he read aloud, his voice the only sound in the silent library. When 3 centuries have turned, and the world beyond remembers not the crown of ice, and the guardian stands alone among his frozen children, and despair has worn the edges of his hope to nothing, then shall come the thaw. Not from within, but from without. Not through power, but through sacrifice. Not by magic, but by the one thing magic cannot touch. A heart unchanged by time. A love that refuses to forget. Iskeran read the passage 3 times, each word settling into his mind like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread outward through his understanding. 3 centuries, the exact time that had passed, the world that had forgotten him. That much was certainly true. But the rest, this talk of thaw and sacrifice and unchanged hearts, what could it mean? He had sacrificed everything already. His kingdom, his family, his own existence beyond these frozen borders. What more could possibly be required? He closed the codex and stood in the silent library, feeling the weight of the prophecy settle over him like a new burden added to the many he already carried. For 300 years, he had been reactive, trying to break a curse that had already been cast, attempting to undo what had been done. But prophecy suggested a different approach, not breaking the curse, but waiting for conditions to align, for the right moment when the magic might finally be vulnerable. The tremors he had felt in the curse, the changes in the aurora, the whispers on the wind, perhaps these were signs that the moment was approaching. Perhaps after 3 centuries of isolation, the world was finally ready to remember the Ice King of the North. But how would this remembering come? Who in the world beyond Norvengard even knew his kingdom had existed? The curse had not merely frozen his people in time, it had erased Norvengard from the memory of the world, removed it from maps and histories, caused those who had once known of the Northern Kingdom to forget it had ever been. Iskerin left the library and made his way to the highest tower of the palace, a journey that took him up a spiral staircase of 563 steps. He had counted them many times during his long isolation. At the top was an observatory, a room with walls of pure ice that allowed an unobstructed view of the lands in all directions. Here, he kept instruments that measured the flow of magic in the world, delicate constructs of crystal and silver that had been created by the greatest artificers of old Norvengard. The instruments were all active, their needles and dials moving in ways they had not moved for decades. The ley lines, the invisible rivers of magical energy that flowed through the world, were shifting. Something significant was happening beyond the borders of his frozen kingdom. Something that was affecting the very fabric of magic itself. Iskerin studied the readings, his mind working through possibilities. A great working of magic somewhere in the world? A natural phenomenon that affected the flow of energy? Or perhaps something related to the curse itself? Some external change that was weakening the bonds that held Norvengard outside of time. As he pondered these questions, movement in the distance caught his eye. Iskerin froze, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing. There, at the very edge of his kingdom, where the frozen tundra met the slightly less frozen tundra that marked the border of Norvengard's curse, something was moving. For the first time in 300 years, something living had approached his kingdom. The Ice King pressed his face close to the wall, his breath forming patterns of frost on the already frozen surface. The figure was small, human-sized, wrapped in furs that marked them as a traveler from the south. He moved slowly, struggling against the wind and snow that was ever present at Norvengard's borders. As Iskerin watched, the figure stumbled, fell, rose again with evident difficulty. They were alone, which was strange. No one traveled the northern wastes alone, not if they valued their life. Yet here was someone doing exactly that, making their way directly toward the one place in the north that no one should have been able to find, that no one should have even remembered existed. A spark of something Iskerin had not felt in centuries flared in his chest. Excitement, perhaps, or fear, or some combination of both. He left the observatory at a run, descending the stairs 3 at a time, racing through the palace halls with a speed that belied his ancient nature. He had to reach the border, had to see who this impossible traveler was, had to understand why they had come. The prophecy's words echoed in his mind, not from within, but from without. The journey from the palace to the kingdom's border took Iskerin just under an hour, even moving at his fastest pace. He could have used his magic to transport himself instantly, but something made him want to make the journey on foot, to feel the reality of movement after so long sitting still. He passed through Crystal Haven, through streets where his frozen subjects stood eternal guard over shops and homes. He passed through the great gates of the city, massive constructs of iron and ice that had not been opened since the day the curse fell. He passed through the outlying villages, through farmlands where crops stood frozen in their fields, forever on the verge of harvest. Finally, he reached the border, marked by a line of standing stones that the first rulers of Norvengard had erected to define their territory. Beyond these stones, the world was muted, colors less vibrant, sounds less clear. This was the edge of the curse, the boundary between frozen time and the world that continued to turn. Iskerin could cross this boundary if he wished, could walk out into the wider world, but he never had. To leave Norvengard would have been to abandon his people. That was something he could never do. The traveller had collapsed just beyond the standing stones, their body a small, dark shape against the white snow. Iskerin could see their chest rising and falling. They were alive, but barely. Without thinking about the consequences, acting on an instinct that came from being a ruler who had once cared deeply for the welfare of others, Iskeran stepped across the boundary. The moment his foot touched the ground beyond the standing stones, he felt it, a rush of sensation, of time flowing around him instead of standing still. It was disorienting after centuries of timelessness, like stepping from a quiet room into a roaring river. He reached the traveller in moments and knelt beside them, carefully turning them over. The furs fell away from their face, and Iskerin found himself looking at a young woman, perhaps 25 winters old, with dark hair that reminded him painfully of Alara. Her lips were blue with cold, her skin pale from exposure, but her eyes, when they fluttered open, were a warm brown that seemed to hold depths of determination. "The Ice King," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I found you. I remembered. Those words, I remembered," struck Iskerin with the force of a physical blow. The curse made people forget. That was part of its power, part of what made it unbreakable. Yet here was someone who had remembered, who had somehow retained knowledge of Norvengard and its ruler, who had travelled across the frozen north alone to find a kingdom that should not have existed in anyone's memory. "Who are you?" Iskeran asked, his own voice rough from centuries of speaking only to himself. "How do you know of me?" The woman's eyes closed again, and for a moment Iskerin feared she had slipped into unconsciousness, or worse. But then she spoke, each word an effort. "My name is Astrid. My grandmother. She was from Norvengard. She escaped the day before the curse fell. She carried the memory, passed it down, told me to find you, told me you were waiting." Astrid's words rearranged Iskerin's understanding of everything. Someone had escaped the curse, had carried the memory of Norvengard out into the world, had kept that memory alive through generations until it reached this woman who had undertaken an impossible journey to find him. The prophecy's words came back to him, a heart unchanged by time, a love that refuses to forget. He gathered Astrid into his arms, marveling at how light she was, how fragile compared to his own timeless existence. He carried her back across the boundary into Norvengard, and as he did, he felt something shift in the air around them. The curse, which had held absolute for 3 centuries, trembled. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but Iskeran had spent so long studying the curse that he could feel every nuance of its structure. Bringing Astrid into Norvengard, bringing someone who remembered from the outside world, had created a crack in the magic, tiny but real. He took her to the palace, to his own chambers, where a fire burned that gave off no heat, but also required no fuel, one of the many paradoxes of his frozen kingdom. He laid her on his bed, the first person besides himself to occupy it in 300 years, and used his magic to slowly warm her, careful not to do it too quickly, lest the shock harm her. As colour returned to her face and her breathing steadied, Iskeran sat beside the bed and waited. It took several hours before Astrid fully woke. When she did, her eyes went wide as she took in her surroundings. The room of ice and silver, the magical fire, and most of all, Iskaran himself, the legendary Ice King made real. She sat up slowly, and Iskaran noticed she was stronger than he had expected, recovering with a resilience that spoke of determination and preparation. "I'm really here," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "Norvengard. It's exactly as my grandmother described it. The Jewel of the North, she called it. She said it was the most beautiful place in the world." "Your grandmother," Iskaran said gently. "What was her name?" "Senna," Astrid replied. "She was a weaver in Crystalhaven. She had gone to visit her sister in the Southern Territories, and was delayed by a storm. When she returned, she found nothing. At first, she thought she had lost her way, that she had somehow ended up in the wrong place, that she knew these lands too well for that. Norvengard had simply vanished." Iskaran remembered Senna, though the memory was distant. She had been young when he had last seen her. Just a girl, really, learning her craft from her mother. That she had escaped the curse by pure chance seemed almost too perfect, as if fate itself had been laying groundwork for this moment 3 centuries in advance. "She tried to tell people," Astrid continued. "She went to the southern kingdoms, to the historians and the map makers, and told them about Norvengard, but no one believed her. They said there was no kingdom in the north, that she must have dreamed it or invented it. The curse had done its work well, but Senna refused to forget. She married, had children, and she told them all about the homeland she had lost. Most of them thought she was mad, or that she was telling stories. But my mother believed her, and she told me, and I believed too." "Why did you come?" Iskaran asked. "What made you attempt such a dangerous journey?" Astrid's expression grew serious. "Because my grandmother's final words before she died were about Norvengard. She made me promise that I would find it, that I would find you. She said the curse could only be broken by someone from outside who remembered, and that 3 centuries would pass before the time was right. She said..." Astrid paused, as if unsure whether to continue. "Say it," Iskaran urged. "She said that you had been waiting alone all this time, that you had never stopped trying to save your people, and that you deserved to know someone still remembered, even if nothing could be done." The Ice King felt something crack inside himself, a different kind of breaking than the magical tremor in the curse. This was an emotional rupture, the wall he had built around his heart over centuries of isolation suddenly crumbling. Tears formed in his eyes, the first he had shed in 200 years, and they froze on his cheeks as they fell, tiny diamonds of ice that caught the light and sparkled. "I have waited," he said softly, "and I have tried everything, but I could never find the key to breaking the curse." Astrid reached out and took his hand, and Iskaran was shocked by the warmth of her touch, by the reminder of what living flesh felt like. "Show me your kingdom," she said. "Show me the people my grandmother loved, even if we cannot save them. Let me see what she remembered so clearly." And so Iskaran led Astrid through Norvengard, showing her Crystalhaven in all its frozen glory, introducing her to his subjects who stood like statues throughout the city. He showed her the marketplace where her grandmother would have worked, the weaver's district with its looms still threaded with half-finished tapestries. He showed her the palace gardens where ice flowers bloomed eternal, never wilting, never growing, caught forever in their peak beauty. He showed her his family, Ilara and Freya, still standing on the balcony where they had been when the curse fell, and Astrid wept for them, tears that marked the first real grieving Iskerin had witnessed for his lost kingdom in all the long centuries. As they walked and talked, Iskerin felt the curse continue to tremble. Each hour Astrid spent in Norvengard, each memory she shared of what her grandmother had told her, each moment she existed as a living link between the frozen kingdom and the world that had forgotten it, weakened the magic that held them. By the time they returned to the palace, Iskerin could feel it clearly. The curse was failing. "It's you," he said to Astrid as they stood in the throne room. "You are the key." The prophecy spoke of a heart unchanged by time, a love that refuses to forget. Your grandmother loved Norvengard so much that she kept its memory alive for 3 centuries, passing that love down through her family until it reached you. That's what the curse cannot withstand. Not power, not magic, but memory preserved through generations. Love that refuses to die. Astrid looked around the throne room with new understanding. Then what do we do? How do we finish breaking the curse? Iskerin walked to his throne and removed the crown from his head, the crown of ice and silver that had marked him as king for 3 centuries. He held it out to Astrid. The curse was designed to isolate Norvengard, to make the world forget. But you remembered. You came. You brought the outside world back to us. Now, we need to do the same in reverse. We need to bring Norvengard back to the world. He placed the crown in her hands. Take this beyond the border. Return to your home, to your people. Show them this crown. Tell them the story of Norvengard. Make them remember. When enough people in the outside world hold the memory of this kingdom in their hearts, when we exist in the collective consciousness of the world again, the curse will have no power. We will snap back into time, back into the world, as if we had never left. Astrid held the crown, feeling its weight, understanding the magnitude of what he was asking. But that could take years, decades. How will you survive that much longer alone? "I have already survived 3 centuries, Iskerin said with a sad smile. "I can endure whatever time is necessary. Besides, I won't be truly alone anymore. Now I know someone remembers, someone cares. That changes everything." But Astrid shook her head. There has to be another way. The prophecy spoke of sacrifice. What if... She paused, thinking. What if the sacrifice is mine to make, not yours? You've already sacrificed everything. Maybe it's time someone sacrificed something for you. Before Iskerin could ask what she meant, Astrid closed her eyes and clasped the crown tightly. She began to speak in a language Iskerin didn't recognize at first, but then he realized it was Old Norvengardian, the ancient dialect that predated even Vormak I. His eyes widened as he understood. Senna had taught her family not just memories of Norvengard, but its language, its magic, its very essence. Astrid was working a spell, one that Iskerin quickly recognized as incredibly dangerous. She was offering herself as a bridge, using her life force to connect Norvengard to the outside world, to pull the kingdom back into the flow of time, by anchoring it to her own timeline. It was brilliant and terrible. It would work, but the strain might kill her. "Stop!" Iskerin commanded, rushing forward. "You'll die!" "I'm willing to risk it," Astrid said. Her voice strained as power built around her. My grandmother spent her whole life mourning what she had lost. She passed that grief down to my mother, to me, Let me turn that grief into something good. Let me be the one who brings Norvengard home. The magic swirled around them both now, visible as streams of light that flowed between Astrid and the very walls of the throne room. Iskaran could feel the curse shattering, breaking apart under the assault of this impossible spell, but he could also feel Astrid weakening, her life force being consumed by the working. Without thinking, acting on instinct and 3 centuries of mastered magic, Iskaran joined his power to hers. The Ice King reached out and took Astrid's hands, the crown held between their joined palms. He poured his own magic into the spell, adding his strength to hers, sharing the burden she had tried to take on alone. Together, their combined power surged through Norvengard, touching every frozen citizen, every stopped moment, every suspended second of the last 300 years. The curse broke with a sound like the world's largest mirror shattering. Time rushed back into Norvengard like a flood, and suddenly everything was moving again. In the marketplace, merchants completed sales that had been frozen mid-transaction. In homes throughout Crystal Haven, families finished conversations that had been interrupted 3 centuries ago. On the palace balcony, Alara and Freya gasped as time resumed, finding themselves looking at a city unchanged yet somehow different. And in the throne room, Iskaran and Astrid collapsed together, the spell complete, the curse broken, the cost paid. The Ice King looked up at the ceiling of his throne room and saw, for the first time in 300 years, dust motes floating in the air, tiny particles that moved and drifted, because time was flowing again, because change was possible again, because his kingdom had returned to the world. Beside him, Astrid breathed heavily but smiled. "We did it," she whispered. "Your people are free." Iskaran took her hand and helped her to her feet. Outside, he could hear sounds he had not heard in centuries, voices raised in confusion and wonder, footsteps as people moved through the streets, the living sounds of the kingdom restored. He looked at Astrid, this impossible woman who had travelled across the world to remember what everyone else had forgotten, and he knew that whatever came next, Norvengard would face it, not alone, but as part of the world again, connected, remembered, and finally free. The forgotten Ice King of the North was forgotten no more.